Hi, welcome to Chapter 10 vocabulary video. This is also a relatively short chapter, and because Chapter 8 is such a whopper, and you need to know Chapter 9 still because the next test is Chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9, and 10, those 5 chapters. All right, this quiz, Chapter 10 quiz, will also potentially include words from Chapters 8 and 9, so review those videos. Alrighty, Chapter 10 is a bit about antibiotics. Antibiotics are a type of chemotherapy. Chemotherapy is a word that means chemicals used to treat, literally. So we tend to think of chemotherapy as being something that people undergo during cancer treatment. They are taking chemicals to treat their cancer. But anytime you're taking drugs, if you take Advil for a headache, that's a type of chemotherapy. So we tend to use it like colloquially with cancer, but any type of drug that you take to treat something is a form of chemotherapy. So antibiotics are a type of chemotherapy. Sometimes you take drugs or undergo medical treatments to prevent disease. That's called prophylaxis. Prophylaxis is prevention. My dentist, when I get a note card about my teeth cleaning, he still says your appointment for your prophylaxis is on such and such date because it's a preventative cleaning. It's preventative. The classic example of prophylaxis in medicine, namely in microbiology, would be vaccines. Vaccines are an injection that stimulates your immune system so that it prevents you from getting ill with certain microbes. Antibiotics are a type of chemotherapy. They are drugs that can kill bacteria, antibio, living things. So they work against bacteria. It technically means against any living thing, but if we're talking about a drug for a worm or a fungus, we call it an antihelminthic or an antifungal. So antibiotics is really a term that we reserve for antibacterial agents. So antibiotics do not work for viruses. We do have a class of drugs called antivirals. They're small, but antibiotics are antibacteria drugs. The minimum inhibitory concentration, or MIC, is the smallest amount of a drug that you can give that will inhibit growth of bacteria. So when if you have strep throat and the strep culture is sent to the lab, they may actually do this kind of testing to see what dosage of strep to give you. Usually they just give you a generally recommended amount. But if somebody had a very resistant organism, they may test it to see if larger doses of antibiotics will inhibit the organism. So this is used in a lab environment, the minimum inhibitory concentration. And ideally you want an organism to have a low minimum inhibitory concentration. In other words, a very small amount of drug is enough to inhibit its growth. So most drugs do have side effects and are toxic at some level. So the therapeutic index of a drug is a comparison of its toxicity to its effectiveness. So it's a ratio where you divide the toxic dose, which you hope would be very large, as in you'd have to give a large amount of the drug for it to actually be toxic, divided by the effective dose, which we hope is small, that a very small amount of it actually works to kill or inhibit bacterial growth. So ideally you want your drugs to have a large therapeutic index, or TI. And so when doctors are prescribing medications, there's often a list that they can choose from. And there's a lot of things they have to take into consideration, like other conditions the patient may have or other drugs they're taking. But one of the things that they will look at is the therapeutic index, and presumably prescribe the one with the highest therapeutic index. Selective toxicity is something that's important in designing drug design. So when you design an antibiotic, for example, you want it to be toxic to just the pathogen, not the host, us. So selective toxicity, or selectively toxic, means that we try to find drugs that will only target and be toxic to the pathogen and not to our bodies, or even if we can find ones that are selectively toxic to the pathogens and not to our good bacteria. So the more selectively toxic, the more specific the drug is for the bacteria, the better. So we can categorize antibiotics oftentimes into two broad categories. There are broad spectrum drugs or broad spectrum antibiotics, and there are narrow spectrum antibiotics. So broad spectrum, they target a wide range of bacteria. So like all gram-positive and all gram-negative bacteria die with this drug. All right, broad spectrum kills a lot of different types of bacteria. And these are often given when somebody has an infection, but the doctors don't necessarily know what it is yet. They haven't diagnosed it, but they want to start treating right away. They just throw a strong broad spectrum antibiotic. Or maybe somebody has a multi-species infection, so they need a drug that can kill multiple types of bacteria. Narrow spectrum antibiotics are the preferred one because, again, they're more specific, they're more selectively toxic. Broad spectrum antibiotics will take out a lot of your commensal bacteria, so they tend to have more side effects related to like digestion and diarrhea and whatnot. Narrow spectrum antibiotics target just one type of bacteria, not one species, but like just gram-negatives or just gram-positives. There's still thousands of different gram-positives that will be killed by narrow spectrum, but they are more specific. And when a doctor knows what your specific disease agent is, they might switch you from a broad spectrum to a narrow spectrum antibiotic. Drug resistance has evolved in a lot of different bacteria. They have picked up genes for resistance to different antibiotics, whether from conjugation or transformation or transduction or any of those horizontal gene transfer pathways we've talked about. They've picked up R factors, resistance plasmids, and have become drug resistant. And we'll talk in lecture about the many different mechanisms that they've evolved in order to be resistant to drugs. So since our commensal flora are often decimated by antibiotics because they're not terribly specific and they kill a lot of our good microbes along with bad ones, it's thought that probiotics can be really beneficial to health. So probiotics are foods or supplements that contain healthy bacteria, like normal flora, to help repopulate the gut. The research is still sort of out on this one, probably because we just haven't found the right combination or the right species of bacteria to actually give as supplements. So there are some studies that say that like yogurt helps with digestion, helps populate the gut with good bacteria for digestion. There's lactobacillus in yogurt. There's also lactobacilli in a healthy vaginal flora. So some say eating yogurt helps with yeast infections, so it doesn't make a lot of sense how those lactobacilli would get from your intestines to your vagina, but so the jury is kind of out on probiotics, but they don't hurt. There's no studies to say they hurt, so a lot of people take them, may have real benefits or may have placebo benefits, but theoretically, probiotics are like the drugs of the future, finding what good bacterial populations we need and putting them in a pill that we can give to people to reset healthy gut bacteria or healthy vaginal microbes, what have you, is definitely on the brink of the future. Another thing that we can do dietarily to promote the growth of good bacteria is to make sure we're consuming plenty of prebiotics. So prebiotics are like food for our good microbes. So bacteria, for example, really like to munch on insoluble fiber, or actually soluble fibers. So foods with a lot of fiber, basically whole foods, whole grains, whole fruits, whole vegetables, are rich in the substances that our gut bacteria like, whereas foods that are high in sugars and preservatives are sort of foods that do not feed our good microbes and potentially feed not so good ones. So prebiotics, you can find prebiotic supplements, but again, the research is really not so hot on those. It's food, prebiotics in food, that's beneficial. Some drugs, like antibiotics, can cause allergic reactions. An allergy is a hypersensitive response of the immune system where it recognizes something really that's not very harmful as if it was something harmful and it starts to attack it. We'll talk a lot more about allergy in the next unit. And then the last word is superinfection, which sounds like it would be an infection with a superbug, a drug-resistant bacteria, but it's not. A superinfection is overgrowth of a resident microbe. So a yeast infection is a classic example. Yeast are Candida albicans are normal flora of the vagina, but when you take antibiotics and you wipe out some of those bacteria in the vagina, the yeast overgrows. And then you get a yeast infection, which is really a yeast superinfection. C. diff is another classic example of a superinfection. It's often found normally in the gastrointestinal tract, but taking lots of antibiotics can wipe out all the neighboring bacteria and lead to an overgrowth of Clostridium difficile, C. diff, and lead to C. diff superinfection. So it is not an infection with antibiotic-resistant superbugs. It is an infection which is just an overgrowth of normal bacteria that need to be checked. That's all.